I remember the day I first realized that life could be heavy in a way that no one else seemed to notice. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the sunlight filters through the curtains, making everything look golden and soft. Outside, children laughed and ran barefoot through the street, their voices carefree and full of life. I stood by the window, staring at them, feeling a weight on my chest I couldn't name. At the time, I thought it was normal, that everyone carried invisible burdens no one spoke of. My family had always told me to be patient, to obey, to make things right by enduring quietly. So I endured. Marriage came like a gentle tide, at first promising warmth and security. My husband was polite, attentive, careful with his words. The first few months were easy. I smiled without fear, laughed without hesitation, but soon the small cracks began to show. A word here, a glance there, little critiques disguised as concern. You should have cooked this better. Why did you wear that? You didn't greet me properly this morning. The first time I noticed the fear, it was subtle. I said something wrong at dinner, a simple comment about a friend's wedding, and his silence cut through the air like ice. I remember staring at him, unsure what I had done, and he said nothing, not a word. But the quiet carried a weight I hadn't known existed. It started to shape my days. I began timing my steps, adjusting my voice, smoothing the edges of myself to avoid his displeasure. I stopped laughing freely. I stopped asking questions. I stopped noticing when the sun rose or set. My world contracted to the four walls of our home, and even those felt confining. One evening, I accidentally spilled tea on the kitchen counter. The first few drops seemed harmless, but when he noticed, he didn't shout, he didn't curse, he only stared, his eyes narrowing slowly, as if measuring the depth of my failure. And then he said, softly but sharply, "Careless." That single word haunted me. I whispered it over and over in my head, "Careless, careless, careless." It became a mantra, a rhythm I could not shake. I started apologizing for things before they even happened, thinking, anticipating, shrinking myself so I wouldn't trigger his anger. Days blended into months. I stopped speaking to my friends. Phone calls became rare. Letters went unanswered. I convinced myself that the world outside my house wasn't important. Inside, the silence was thick, heavy, unrelenting. I learned to move quietly, to make my presence barely noticeable. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake, listening to the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant barking of dogs. In those hours, I felt the first stirrings of hopelessness. I wondered if this quiet, this weight, was what life was meant to be. I felt invisible and small, as if my existence was only validated by the absence of mistakes. Yet, I clung to tiny fragments of myself, a book I secretly read in the mornings, a letter I wrote but never sent, a memory of laughter from my childhood. Those fragments were fragile, like little sparks in a dark room, but they kept me alive. One day, I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, her smile forced, her posture bent from years of shrinking. I whispered to her softly, "You're still here. You're still here." That whisper became my only anchor. In the suffocating silence of the house, it was proof that I existed outside of his control. even if only in thought. But the cracks kept growing, and I could feel that one day the silence would break, not into peace, but into something far more unbearable. The first time I realized the walls of our home were closing in on me was when I was standing in the kitchen, chopping onions for dinner. The knife felt heavy in my hand, the sharp edge slicing through the vegetable, but never through the tension that filled the air. He had been unusually quiet all day, watching me with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the rhythm of chopping, but his voice came suddenly from the doorway. "Why are you cutting them like that? Do it properly or I'll do it myself." I froze. My hands hovered over the onions. I could feel my pulse racing, my chest tightening. I knew any answer, any excuse would be met with irritation or worse. I whispered, I'll try again." He didn't move, just stood there, his eyes scanning me as if measuring my worth. He said, "You never try hard enough." That was all. No yelling, no throwing of objects, just words, precise and cold, cutting through me like glass. By that evening, I had learned to move around the house with calculated caution. I stopped humming to myself. I walked slowly so the floorboards wouldn't creak. Even my breathing became soft and measured, as though loud air could provoke him. The isolation grew. He complained whenever I wanted to see a friend, always finding a reason why it was improper or unnecessary. "Why would you go there? They don't care about you like I do. They only waste your time." And so I stayed home, letting the days pass in silence. I stopped reaching out to my family, stopped asking for advice, stopped dreaming. The small sparks of myself I had tried to protect, the books, the letters, the memories, were tucked away, hidden from view. One night, I woke to the sound of him moving in the dark. I hadn't heard him come home. My heart hammered as I lay still, listening to the faint scrape of his shoes, the soft sighs as he moved through the apartment. When he entered the bedroom, he leaned against the doorframe, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. He didn't ask again. He just left. After that night, I began to anticipate his moods like a weather pattern. His silence could bring storms worse than shouting. A glance could chill me for hours. I stopped expressing opinions. I stopped asking questions. I stopped believing that my voice mattered. There were occasional moments of kindness. He would smile, hand me a cup of tea, or compliment a meal. But those moments were brief, unpredictable, and never enough to erase the fear. They became like bait, luring me into believing the storm had passed, only to make the next one sharper, more punishing. I tried to keep some part of myself alive. I wrote in a notebook hidden beneath my mattress, noting small thoughts, fragments of dreams, memories of laughter. It was my secret rebellion, my proof that I still existed. But even that came with risk. One day, I had left it slightly open, and he noticed. "What is this?" he asked, flipping through the pages. I tried to laugh it off, but he shook his head. "You're wasting your time. Stop dreaming. Stop imagining things that aren't real." That moment broke something inside me. I realized that even my inner life, the sanctuary I had kept in writing, was under siege. I became careful, cautious, measured in every breath, every glance, every step. My identity shrank until it barely fit inside me. But even in the darkest corners of my confinement, I held on to one truth. I could not live like this forever. Somewhere deep, buried beneath years of fear and silence, the thought of escape took root. It was tiny, fragile, and easy to crush, but it existed, and I would cling to it, even if I had no idea what freedom would look like. The breaking points didn't come suddenly. They came like slow drips of water wearing away stone, until I was raw and hollowed out, standing in a life that felt more like a trap than a home. Each day brought a new way to be silenced, controlled, or belittled. I began counting the hours until I could lie down in bed and let the exhaustion numb me. One evening, he returned later than usual. I had prepared dinner exactly as I knew he liked it, measured, seasoned, and arranged perfectly. I watched him eat, my heart hammering, expecting the brief moment of approval that occasionally flickered across his face. But tonight there was no flicker. He set the plate down and said nothing. Minutes passed. Silence pressed against me like a physical weight. Then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "You always think you do enough, but you never do. You're careless, clumsy, useless." I felt my knees weaken, my hands gripping the table as though it could hold me upright. Words, small and deliberate, had always been sharper than any blow. Tonight, they carved a hollow in my chest. I retreated to the bedroom, tears falling silently. I whispered to myself, "I am enough. I am enough." But the words felt fragile, like glass. I tried to sleep, but my mind replayed the insults, twisted them into a storm of self-doubt, and left me awake until dawn. The next day, I discovered small punishments disguised as care. If I made a mistake, he would correct it publicly, in front of neighbors or colleagues. Sometimes he withheld affection. Sometimes he ignored me entirely. Every minor imperfection became an opportunity for control, every smile a potential threat. I began to shrink further, retreating into myself. I stopped voicing opinions, even when asked. I stopped expressing desire or discomfort. I learned to anticipate his moods, to measure my words, to place myself quietly in the corners of our shared spaces. The nights were worse. I would lie awake listening to every creak, every sound, imagining threats that weren't there, fearing storms that hadn't yet arrived. Sleep was no refuge. Even in dreams, his presence was looming, cold, inescapable. One particularly brutal night, he raised his voice over something minor, my inability to fold clothes properly. His shouting shook me to my core. I tried to explain, tried to apologize, tried to make myself small enough to disappear into the floor. None of it worked. His anger was a force, an unstoppable tide, and I was only a fragile vessel in its path. After he left, I found myself shaking, sobbing, unable to breathe. I pressed my face into the pillow and whispered desperate prayers I had not spoken in years. Prayers for safety, for escape, for someone, anyone, to notice me and understand. It was in those moments, curled on the bed, consumed by fear, that I realized something terrifying. I could not survive like this forever. I was fading, disappearing under the weight of his control. If I stayed, I would lose myself entirely, piece by piece, until only fear remained. And yet, the thought of leaving terrified me. Leaving meant stepping into the unknown, facing the world alone, risking judgment, poverty, and danger. but staying meant certain emotional death. Somewhere deep, a small, fragile ember of hope flickered. Escape was possible. Survival was possible. I did not yet know how, but I knew I could not continue to live as a ghost in my own life. The decision to leave did not arrive like a thunderclap. It crept in quietly, a constant hum beneath the fear, until it became louder than the dread that had kept me silent for years. I began to notice cracks in his control, times when he was away, moments when I could move unseen, breathe without the weight of his scrutiny. Each of these moments became an opportunity, a small step toward freedom.
I started preparing in secret. Small things at first, saving money from my meager allowance, hiding a few important documents, memorizing bus routes and city streets. Every detail was a thread in a fragile lifeline I was weaving for myself. I could feel the fear clawing at me, reminding me of the dangers of being caught. But the fear was paired now with a sharper edge, determination. One evening, I packed a small bag, clothes, a few personal items, my notebook, and the precious documents that would prove my identity. I did not take much. Freedom required moving lightly, invisibly, as if I were a shadow slipping through a door. My heart hammered as I stuffed the bag into the hollow beneath the bed. I checked every lock, every window, and waited until I knew he would be asleep. The night I left, I moved like a ghost. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. I walked through the dark streets, clutching my bag, feeling the city around me as if I were learning it for the first time. The air was crisp, filled with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but more alive than I had in years. I did not look back. The thought of turning around, of seeing him watching, waiting, was unbearable. Instead, I focused on the path ahead, on the unknown that stretched before me. I reminded myself, this is survival. This is freedom. I found a small shelter run by women who had faced abuse themselves. They welcomed me quietly, without judgment, understanding the mixture of fear and relief that must have painted my face. For the first time in years, I did not have to hide who I was. I could cry openly, speak my thoughts, and feel the warmth of empathy. The first nights were terrifying. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed a potential threat. But slowly, with the support of others, I began to breathe again. I started to sleep without shaking, to eat without fear, to speak without trembling. Each day was a small victory, each morning a proof of existence. I began to write again, pouring years of suppressed emotions onto the pages of my journal. I wrote about fear, anger, grief, and the bittersweet taste of freedom. Writing became my lifeline, a way to reclaim the pieces of myself he had tried to erase. And yet, even in this sanctuary, I was aware of the lingering pain. Memories did not vanish. They followed me like quiet shadows, but for the first time, they did not control me. I had left the cage, and now I had the power to decide how I would move in the world. It was not perfect. Freedom came with fear, uncertainty, and the constant challenge of rebuilding. but it was mine. Every breath I took, every step I walked, every word I spoke was a rebellion against the years of silence and submission. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live. The shelters smelled of warm meals, cleaning supplies, and faint traces of perfume, a mixture of practicality and humanity. It was small, cramped in some areas, but safe. For the first time in years, I didn't have to check over my shoulder or measure my words. The walls were not just walls. They were a promise that I could breathe without fear. Other women lived there too, each carrying their own invisible scars. Some were young, barely out of their teens, their eyes wide with the shock of survival. Others were older, hardened by years of oppression, their movements precise and careful. We rarely spoke at first, only exchanging quiet nods or half smiles, each of us understanding without words the weight the other carried. I remember the first woman who approached me. Her name was Amina, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to look straight through me. She didn't ask me anything. She just offered a cup of tea and said softly, "You're safe here. Take your time." That small kindness broke something open inside me. For the first time in a long while, I believed it. Days passed in a rhythm of routine and recovery. Breakfast, chores, small classes on life skills, evenings of quiet reflection. I learned how to manage my fears, how to prepare meals without trembling, how to sleep without nightmares dominating every hour. Slowly, the habit of living returned. We shared our stories in whispers, in tears, in scribbled journals that no one else would read. Hearing the pain of others made my own feel lighter, more real, and less isolating. I realized that suffering shared is no longer just a burden. It becomes a bridge, connecting lives in understanding and empathy. The first time I laughed out loud without fear, it startled even me. It was during a simple evening game, a moment of levity that felt almost forbidden. A few of us collapsed into fits of quiet giggles, clutching our sides, tears running down cheeks. In that moment, I felt a spark of the woman I had been before, the one who had believed in joy. I started writing again, filling pages with thoughts, fears, and reflections. Words that had been trapped inside me for years poured onto paper, and I realized that writing was not just a habit. It was survival, healing, proof of existence. I also began to reclaim control in small, practical ways. I managed my own money, learned how to navigate public transportation safely, and found a small part-time job helping with administrative work at the center. Each small task, each step toward independence was a declaration. I belong to myself now. But even amidst these victories, shadows lingered. Memories of abuse would surface unexpectedly. A raised voice on the street, a shadowed glance, the sudden panic of a door slamming, and I would flinch. Some nights, nightmares still dragged me back into his control, forcing me awake in cold sweat. Yet I no longer felt powerless. I had survived the worst. I could survive these echoes.
And through it all, the women at the shelter became my family. We celebrated birthdays quietly, cooked together, shared clothes, and sometimes simply sat in silence, letting our presence for each other be enough. In their company, I began to feel the roots of trust grow inside me again, slow and careful, but steady. The shelter was not just a physical space, it was a turning point. It was the first place in years where I could breathe, move, speak, and exist without fear. And it was here, among others who had survived, that I realized something vital. Survival is not enough. One must learn to live again, to reclaim the pieces of oneself that were stolen, to build a life that feels like it belongs to you. Leaving the shelter was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had learned to survive there, but life outside would demand independence, decisions, and constant vigilance. I found a small apartment, barely more than a single room with a narrow balcony where the morning sun poured in. It smelled faintly of old paint and dust, but to me, it smelled like freedom. The first few days were quiet. I unpacked the small bag I had brought, arranging my few belongings with care. My journal went on the small table by the window. I placed a plant Amina had given me on the sill. Each tiny action, folding clothes, sweeping the floor, making tea, felt monumental. For years, I had not been allowed the simple dignity of routine, and now I was reclaiming it with trembling hands and a cautious heart. I started working part-time at a local office, doing clerical tasks that allowed me to focus on productivity rather than fear. I learned to navigate public transport, to interact with strangers without shrinking, to assert myself in small ways. Each day, I felt a little more like the person I had once been and a little more like the person I wanted to become. Friendship was tentative at first. I met a woman named Layla at work who was patient with my silences and subtle flinches. She never pressed me to talk, but she shared small stories over lunch, little pieces of her life that slowly made me feel safe. We laughed quietly over coffee, compared recipes, and one day she simply said, "You're strong. You'll get there." That small acknowledgement of my strength was almost overwhelming. But healing was not linear. Triggers lurked in the ordinary world. A sharp tone in a colleague's voice, a raised hand in the street, even the sound of the wind against the balcony. Each could send my heart racing and my stomach knotting. I had learned techniques to ground myself. Deep breaths, counting backward, whispering truths to myself. You are safe. You are alive. You belong to yourself. I also returned to writing. My journal became more than survival. It became a chronicle of rebuilding. I wrote about my fears, the small victories, the mundane tasks of daily life that once seemed trivial. Each page was a testament to the fact that I was still here, that I could still carve meaning out of pain. Sometimes I allowed myself small joys, a walk through the park, watching children play, a cup of tea in the morning sun, a song on the radio that made me tap my foot unconsciously. Life had returned to me in fragments, delicate and cautious, but real. The apartment became more than a shelter. It became a home. I hung curtains, bought small decorations, planted herbs on the balcony. Each act was an assertion of existence, a refusal to let fear dictate the terms of my life. I began to understand that survival alone was not enough. Living, in all its messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful fullness, was what I deserved. Slowly, I began to make plans for the future. Courses to improve my skills, possible careers that could sustain me. And though the past still whispered in my ear, I was no longer listening to it alone. I had allies, friends, and the hard-won knowledge that I had the strength to face whatever came next. Once I had settled into my small apartment and routine, I began to feel a new urge, a need to turn my survival into something more. The shelter had given me safety, and my small independence gave me breathing room, but I realized that my story could serve a greater purpose. I could help others who were trapped as I once had been, and in doing so, reclaim even more of myself. I returned to the shelter occasionally, this time not as a resident, but as a volunteer. I helped women fill out forms, coached them on job interviews, and most importantly, listened. Listening became my greatest tool. Many women had no one to hear them, no one to validate the pain and fear that weighed them down. I became a witness to their suffering, offering empathy and understanding. The first time a woman cried in my arms, I felt a wave of emotion I could barely hold. Her tears reminded me of the nights I had spent alone, sobbing silently into my pillow. I held her without words, feeling both the weight of her pain and the relief of connection. Later, she whispered, "Thank you for listening." And in that simple acknowledgement, I felt a spark of purpose ignite inside me. I began to offer workshops on practical life skills, budgeting, cooking, applying for jobs, navigating public transportation. I taught what I had learned through hard experience, but I also focused on the emotional lessons, asserting boundaries, recognizing manipulation, trusting one's instincts. The combination of practical skills and emotional guidance gave the women a foothold into independence, just as I had clawed my way out. Some days were harder than others. A woman's breakdown could trigger my own memories, leaving me trembling as I held space for both our pain. But I had learned to separate my past from the present, to care without being consumed. Each success story, an interview landed, a first paycheck, a move into a safe apartment, was a triumph not just for them, but for me. It reaffirmed my belief that life could be rebuilt, one small victory at a time. I also began writing openly about survival, not for public recognition, but as a guide, a validation for those who had no voice. My journals evolved into narratives that could be shared, teaching resilience, self-respect, and the courage to reclaim life. I realized that my experience, once a source of fear and shame, could now become a beacon for others navigating similar darkness. Evenings were quieter now. I would sit on my balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city lights blink and listening to the hum of life outside. Occasionally, I would think of the women I had helped that day, of the little sparks of hope that had emerged, and I allowed myself a small, cautious smile. Life was no longer merely about survival. It was about impact, connection, and the quiet power of persistence. In helping others, I was healing myself. Each story I heard, each hand I held, each tear I wiped, became a thread in a tapestry of resilience, one that connected lives across fear and trauma. I was no longer alone. My survival had become something bigger, a lifeline for others, and a reminder that even in darkness, humanity could shine. Even after years of rebuilding, the past was never far. It lingered in quiet moments, in fleeting shadows, in the smallest details of daily life. I would hear a raised voice on the street and flinch. I would see a man's hand gesture and tense. Sometimes the smell of a particular cologne or the sight of a certain street corner would pull me back into memories I had tried to bury. I knew I couldn't run from it forever. Healing demanded confrontation. One morning, I decided to revisit the neighborhood where I had lived with him. The streets were narrower than I remembered, the buildings worn with age. Yet the fear that had once seemed insurmountable now felt different, smaller, more manageable. I walked slowly, tracing the paths I had once trodden in silence and terror. Passing by the alleyways where his presence had loomed over me, I felt a flicker of panic, but I did not turn back. Instead, I whispered to myself, "You are here. You survived. You are no longer his." Each step forward was both terrifying and liberating. The city that had once trapped me was now a landscape of reclaimed territory. Inside me, memories surged. Times when I had cried silently, times I had endured insults and threats, nights when I had lain awake wishing for escape. The old anger rose in me, raw and bitter, but I let it flow. I allowed myself to feel all of it: fear, grief, shame, and even the faint spark of pride that I had survived it all. I visited the places I had once loved but had abandoned, parks where I had walked with friends, cafes where I had once smiled freely. Each place felt strange, tainted by the memory of fear, but also suffused with potential for healing. I realized that confronting the past did not erase it, but it allowed me to integrate it into the story of who I had become. Therapy, journaling, and long walks became my tools for processing. I wrote letters I never sent, spoke my truths aloud when I was alone, and let tears flow freely without shame. Slowly, the panic attacks became less frequent, the flinches less severe. I learned to identify triggers and remind myself that I was safe, that I was not the frightened girl trapped in that house. Even as I confronted the past, I understood that some scars would never fully fade. They were part of me, a permanent record of endurance. And yet, I also discovered a deeper truth. Survival was not simply about escaping danger. It was about reclaiming identity, establishing boundaries, and learning to exist fully in the world once more. In time, I returned to the shelter, not as a resident, but as a mentor. I told my story in fragments, carefully chosen to give hope, not to traumatize. The young women listened with wide eyes, some nodding, some crying. I realized then that my survival had meaning beyond myself. It could illuminate a path for others, a guide through the darkness I had once navigated alone. Each encounter, each shared story strengthened my resolve. The past would always be with me, but it no longer had the power to define me. I had survived, and that survival had become my armor, my foundation, and my voice. By now, life had settled into a rhythm that felt fragile but real. I had an apartment I could call my own, a steady job, and a circle of friends who understood pieces of my story without needing to know every detail. Each morning, I woke and brewed tea, watched the sun spill gold across the balcony, and reminded myself that I belonged in this life. The small victories of independence were sweeter than I could have imagined. Paying my own bills, managing my own schedule, deciding what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend my time. It all felt monumental. For years, I had lived under someone else's rules, but now the rules were mine. Each decision, no matter how small, reinforced my ownership of life. Friendships deepened slowly. Lila remained my closest confidant, the one who had patiently guided me through awkward social situations, celebrated my successes, and simply let me exist when I was too tired to talk. Together, we cooked meals, exchanged books, and shared quiet evenings filled with laughter that had been absent from my life for too long. I also reconnected with family cautiously. My mother visited, tears streaming as she hugged me. Apologies were whispered, long silences filled with shared understanding. I realized that even when bonds are fractured, trust can be rebuilt, slowly, if the foundation of survival is strong enough.
But life wasn't without struggle. Some days, triggers from the past emerged unexpectedly. A voice that reminded me of him, a shadow on the street, a phrase that carried his tone. My heart would race, my hands would shake, but each time I survived it without retreating into fear, I felt stronger. Each encounter, each challenge became proof that I could live fully in the world again. I also began to mentor women outside the shelter. I taught them not just practical skills, but emotional resilience. I shared my story selectively, highlighting survival and hope, and witnessed their first steps towards independence. Each success of theirs became my own, a reflection of the life I had fought to reclaim.
In the evenings, I often sat on my balcony, notebook in hand, writing about my days, my feelings, my small triumphs. I watched the city hum and realized that life was a series of ordinary moments stitched together. Beauty wasn't in grand gestures, but in simple routines, in laughter shared over coffee, in the quiet pride of being alive and present. The woman I had become was not the frightened girl of my past. She was cautious, but courageous, scarred, but resilient, aware of the darkness that existed in the world, and also of her capacity to survive it. Life was no longer dictated by fear, and that alone felt like triumph. Yet, even in triumph, there was awareness of fragility. Freedom was not absolute. Scars remained. The girl I had been was still alive inside me, her memory a reminder of the cost of survival. I carried that memory with reverence, using it as both armor and compass. Quiet triumph, I realized, was not about perfection or total freedom from pain. It was about persistence, about choosing life every day, about carving out space for joy even when sorrow lingered. It was about standing, no matter how trembling, and claiming your right to exist. I often sit on my balcony at dusk, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The city hums quietly below, alive with people whose lives are untouched by the kind of fear I once knew. And yet, I know that my past still travels with me, a silent companion, a shadow that whispers reminders of pain, of years stolen, of nights spent trembling alone. I have learned that survival is never clean or neat. It carries the weight of memory, of trauma, of what was lost and cannot be reclaimed. The years I lost, the innocence that was taken, the moments I should have been free, they remain, etched into my bones. Some nights I lay awake thinking of the girl I once was, the one who dreamed openly, trusted easily, and laughed without caution. I mourn her quietly, letting the grief pass over me like a wave. But I also honor her. I honor her resilience, her courage, the small sparks of defiance that refused to be extinguished. It was she who whispered, "You are still here. You will survive." And survive I did. Every step of the way, I clawed back fragments of myself, stitched them together with determination, patience, and the quiet refusal to be erased. I have dedicated my life to helping others. Women who arrive at shelters, trembling and unsure, find in me someone who understands, someone who listens without judgment, someone who can guide them through fear with gentle hands and a steady voice. I tell them my story, not to shock, not to sensationalize, but to show them that survival is possible, that they are not alone, and that the path forward, though daunting,
is real. The work is not easy. Some days I carry their pain as heavily as my own. Some nights I relive moments I thought I had buried. But I have learned to carry it differently, not as chains, but as fuel. Every success of theirs, every small victory reminds me of my own journey and the fragile, powerful truth that life can continue even after darkness. I have learned to find beauty in ordinary things. The way sunlight glints off rain on the balcony, the laughter of a child playing nearby, the aroma of fresh bread in the morning. These moments are small, yet they are profound. They remind me that life, even after suffering, can hold tenderness, joy, and meaning. And yet, I do not pretend that the past is gone. The scars are permanent. They live in my body, in the rhythm of my heart, in the sudden flinch when a voice is too loud. They remind me that freedom has a cost, and that survival is not always triumphant in the way the world imagines. But I am still here, scarred, cautious, often haunted, but alive. I am still building, still helping, still breathing fully, even when grief and memory attempt to weigh me down. I have taken the fragments of a stolen life and fashioned them into something enduring, something that can guide others toward hope. And in that quiet, bittersweet existence, I find peace. Not perfect, not free from sorrow, but alive, present, and human. I have survived. I have rebuilt. And I have left a mark for those who come after me, a path illuminated by the truth that even after darkness, life persists. The city continues to hum below, and I continue to sick, writing, remembering, guiding, and surviving. My story, like theirs, is one of both tragedy and resilience. And though the scars remain, so does the life I fought to reclaim. I am alive. I have survived. And in that survival, there is both sorrow and quiet triumph.